are giving different kinds of information according to their nationality. Because that's where you find somebody was sponsored by Kenya to go to UNEP. And so that's a person who's SMSing me and telling me, Balozi, wanasema hivi. Wanasema hivi. Then you think, now this guy, is he telling me the real thing? Or is this the secretariat going through a Kenyan because they know it'll be believable to the Kenyan delegation? And that was the same with the Germans. That was the same with the Brazilians. It doesn't matter. So you're balancing all the time. And in this room, we're negotiating. On the first night, we were there until 2 in the morning. And everyone was now completely exhausted because we're all stating the same arguments in different words. We were stuck. We were completely stuck. Mexico was cheering. Kenya, the Africa group, the United States, the Europeans, all had created distinct camps against one another because they wanted narrower governance options. And so Kenya had to keep reaching, what can we find to negotiate? What can we give them so that we get what's most precious to us? And what is most precious to us? Global universal governance, return of headquarter functions to Kenya. What can we do? So in came the banding about of the name of this organization. And because everyone is tired and everyone's fed up, you find yourself negotiating over something that's ultimately not that important, but it's where all your energy is. And you feel as if I back off on this, my whole position will crumble, including some of the things that I want to happen and some of the things we want to see. So what ultimately happened is we had the good fortune of bringing our ambassador from New York, who had negotiated Rio Plus 20, a very experienced diplomat called Ambassador Macharia Kamau, who has spent his whole professional life in the UN system. He knows it so well. And then we had young diplomats, many of them your age, and they were the ones negotiating the technical details. And they were extremely tough. I remember one young guy, I told him, aren't you exhausted? He told me, Balozi, nitakaa hapa mpaka hao waende nyumbani. And that's part of the reason is because there's a small little tactic that some delegations use, which is you drag out the negotiation. By the time you figure 1, 2, 3 in the morning, the other person just wants to go home. They're just thinking of their family, their sleep. They're no longer thinking of national interests. So they just give in. And what typically tends to happen is that the poorer countries with smaller delegations, as the night wears on, they start to go. And all that's left there is the big countries. Why is that? It's not because of laziness. It's because the stakes as you rise up the geopolitical ladder keep rising. If you're a small Pacific island, does it really matter that Europe won over you? Not really. You just take one of the big countries, adopt their position, and life goes on. But if you're Brazil, and you have very specific interests in agribusiness, in the field of environment, then you're not there to play around. You have very serious interests, and you have to protect them. And I'm proud to say that the Kenyan team, by the time we were leaving, the room was 2, 3 Europeans and about 10 Kenyans, all sitting there, completely determined to not leave. So ultimately, we didn't win the ability to call the organization the UN Environment Organization. It's now called the United Nations Environment Assembly for UNEP. Now you see, that for UNEP was a compromise. It was countries that wanted the power of this body to be rhetorically reduced. Because if you say the United Nations Environment Assembly, it sounds like the UN General Assembly, doesn't it? And yet it's supposed to be subsidiary to the General Assembly. And so they said, you have a universal assembly, but only of UNEP, right? And we agreed to it very quickly because the first thing we understood is, listen to this phrase, United Nations Environment Assembly of the United Nations Environment. No one will ever say it. So it may be written that way, but at the end, in the coming months and years, it'll only be known as the United Nations Environment Assembly. What is written doesn't matter. It's the political import that mattered to Kenya. It was the chance that because of that being a universal body that meets here every 2 years, oh, by the way, we wanted it to meet every year, but we had to concede that one because there were people who wanted it to meet every 4 years. We knew that, okay, now it's a universal membership. What does that mean? It means that there are some countries that will come and open new embassies in Nairobi so that they can be here to negotiate environmental issues. If they do that, that's jobs, that's prestige, that's us being a diplomatic center of diplomatic life on the continent and in the world. So it was very important for that universal option to push through away from a resolution in Rio to an actual working structure in the new dispensation. Then in terms of headquarter functions, we now knew here is where the real trick is. Rather than fight it, because we said it can't be fought because already the assembly in Rio had agreed on it, all we could discuss is the modalities and the way there. And how did we do that? That ultimately ended up being something you kick down the road because other negotiations were so exhausting, so taxing, and you were never going to win this one because all these other countries want these programs in their own country. Europe is nowadays much poorer than it used to be. It has been in a crisis. Europe wants more jobs, and the UN creates good jobs. So some of these issues, but also to host programs that define and can drive the global agenda, very important for many countries. So we said, you know what, there'll be consultants who will look into this, the secretariat will hire them, but we pushed it for something to be negotiated and looked at by the Committee of Permanent Representatives, which is what I sit on and is where a number of ambassadors here in town and abroad are accredited to UNEP. And so that, ladies and gentlemen, in a very illustrated and incomplete way, was some of the negotiations that happened during that time. What did I learn? One is that multilateral negotiation is highly complex as opposed to bilateral negotiation. You're perpetually in, and by complex, I mean something very, very particular. I don't mean complicated. Complicated is a watch. A watch is a really complicated thing, but ultimately it's all predictable. Complex is that every actor is in a dynamic shifting mode and that their shifts are affecting other people's positions. So the Africa position keeps moving and bulging as it's subjected to the dynamics of other positions. The Africa position can be 15 minutes ago, the Egyptian ambassador may have told you this, but that was before his conversation with the American ambassador. And then suddenly, you find his negotiator saying something that you thought is not really where you are, but not really contradicting you that much, but in a subtle way driving you away from where you want to be. In other words, there is constant interaction of each other's positions. And that means holding a static or a linear view of the negotiation is impossible. So you're perpetually in alliances that are crumbling even as they're being built up. And then you're perpetually in debates that appear very fierce, but in the middle of the debate with this particular country or group of countries, you realize that there's a position where they can pivot closer towards you, or you can negotiate something and move to a third position, both of you. Both of you having lost something you wanted, but gained something together. So you could appear very fierce against each other, but you can find a third position. And that, my friends, is why you were being taught etiquette and protocol. Because no matter the heat of the moment. For instance, without giving a particular instance, the suspicion as an African that there's a country across from you that thinks you're inferior to them, that thinks that they're supposed to say what you should do, and you just tell them, yes, sir, just tell me how to do it, and I'll do it exactly as you want me to do it. To see that look in that person's eyes, or in that position, or in their body language, but you have to maintain your cool, your politeness. You cannot allow those kinds of things to interfere with how you represent your country. And so inside yourself, you need tools of behavior and comportment that have nothing to do with your feelings. And this now I'm describing an ideal situation because we're human beings, so people also react. But ultimately, those tools are invaluable. The relationships amongst diplomats and within networks within different countries are invaluable. Your relationship with the Norwegian deputy ambassador or deputy head of mission may be what allows you to take him or her aside and have them be able to give you some sense that there can be some negotiation, some agreement because of the trust between the two of you. So when you're not at the negotiating table, you're perpetually working on your relationships. That's why I attend so many cocktail parties. That's why I constantly go to people to eat. I'm so sick and tired of it, but I have to do it. And people think I'm just wasting tax money, but it's not the case. We don't spend it recklessly, but it's an attempt to build the relationships that Kenya will require in its multilateral engagements. At the same time, in the multilateral sphere, you could be negotiating the environment, but in reality, you're negotiating about Iran's desire or lack of desire for a nuclear weapon. It is because global governance and geopolitical power is felt in many corners. So you may find Russia and America and Syria in some sort of argument over some little resolution, some little paragraph in a resolution on the environment, when in fact they're debating issues outside of that particular issue because they're trying to assert different parts of their primacy over and above each other. So that multilateral diplomacy and negotiation is a very broad table that has no limits. There's nothing like, oh, today we're just talking the environment. We're not talking trade. No. Everything is always in the room with you. The good relationship you came up with, you got with Sri Lanka during a trade negotiation is invaluable when it comes to the environmental negotiation. So relationships, that's number 2 thing I learned in terms of feeling, comportment. Then, and I'm coming to a close, is the issue of your own knowledge. It became clear to me that I needed an extremely nuanced and dynamic view of geopolitical alliances and histories. For instance, why does Colombia tend to take the opposite side of the floor as Brazil? I've been to Colombia, but I didn't know. But if you read history, there's some clues that you'll find. And so I found the need to keep understanding certain historical issues. I also realized the need to have a very good understanding of political geography. And in that way, there were many, many things that I've read in newspapers that were becoming unexpectedly useful. For instance, the relationship between the drought in northern Mexico and the spate of crime and violence in that region. It's not completely caused by that, it's drug trafficking, but there are issues there around climate and globalization, etc. Now, these are things that I've read in newspapers, and because I'm very curious and I read a lot of things, but ultimately, they were all being of some use in the negotiating table, not in a way that I could predict, but certainly in a way that meant that my whole life experience and what I read was coming to serve to be very, very useful. Finally, we came to the last day of the conference, where Kenya had gotten I would say our most critical aims, we had realized them. We hadn't gotten everything we wanted, but we got at least 50% of what we came for. And it was time now to close that particular conference. Except, my friends, with these multilateral negotiations, the negotiation never ends. So there are people who appear to surrender and just kick the debate down the road. They're like, nitakushika tukienda Vienna on this other issue, or Geneva. And so what has happened is countries like Kenya have a tremendously difficult time keeping up with the dynamic complexity of these negotiations. Because it means, if, I'm sure you've learned this, the things you're trying to do is to represent, observe, report, and document. Those 4 principal tasks. And so the issue of documenting and having your documents available as you need them, when you need them, in different negotiations, if you start to imagine the numbers of them, they're extremely difficult to understand, to grasp. Do you see what I mean? Because you went for this trade thing at COMESA. Then you went for this other Indian Ocean Rim Association. And all these things ultimately have something to do with each other. But what we do is we have these enormous files. At the Kenya Mission, and if you ever visit me there, I'll take you to our filing room. It's boxes and boxes and boxes. And then when we're done filling it, we take it to a warehouse, a government warehouse, where now it's put inside there. Then once in a while I ask our secretary, could you get me this thing? She tells me, Balozi, now that one, you wait there first. But if I'm in Geneva and I need the things right there, so one of the great strengths that a lot of the richer countries had was their archiving and their documentation system. So you could see them with iPads and computers constantly downloading, constantly looking up different documents from different times in their databases. And this is a great advantage they had that we didn't have. And in that way, what many African countries and poorer countries end up doing is you end up arguing from your own personal intelligence and your own personal initiative. I tell you, it's a game you can't win for long. Yeah. And so we came to the final day of the conference, and now we've moved into the intersessional sense. In another 2 years, there's going to be another governing council. In that time, we will have tried to get some more movement on the movement of headquarter functions back to Nairobi. 2, we will have hopefully built, created facilities that allow different countries to come and open missions here in a more cost-effective way. And 3, we will have hopefully come up with a much harder, much more clear articulation of the Kenyan foreign policy interest than we have now, and the place of the environment in it, so that when we go into that negotiation, my intention is for us to be one of the strongest negotiating teams at that meeting, because one thing Kenya has is a tremendous group of young people at my mission, at the ministry, and elsewhere, who are truly a cut above many of their counterparts globally, in brackets, especially if their writing skills get stronger. And that, Daktari, has taken more than 15 minutes. But I'm sorry if I went on too long. Let me finish by really thanking you again and letting you know that the Kenya mission to the UN is a very open place. We don't have jobs to dish out, but we've got lots of friendliness to dish out. We've got advice to dish out. We like passionate people. Our doors are always open to them. And so I really envy your teachers the opportunity to spend quality time with you every day. And with that, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm sure now the students are looking forward to becoming like you. Now, I want to introduce you to the Associate Director of the Institute of Diplomacy and International Studies, Professor Gerson Ikiara, who will welcome you and probably thank you.
Yeah, maybe before I do that, I don't know whether we may give you a bit of chance. This was a great lecture, and I think we can give you some few moments if the ambassador has time. You can ask a few questions before I make some concluding remarks. But this was truly a great lecture, and therefore let's give a chance to you to interrogate that a bit. He has really gone very far into these issues and into the multilateral negotiations and with a particular case studies and with a particular context within the Kenyan context. So when we talk about national interest, you are able to see from a very specific example what that means. And when you talk about complexity of negotiations, you have some very clear dimensions of what that actually means and what it takes to be able to actually put that kind of objective into action and achieve your aims. So let me give you some chance to ask some questions, maybe 3 or so. If you make them fairly short, I think the ambassador will be able to answer.
Your Excellency, thank you for that very incisive. You actually carried us from the first moment to the very last. Personally, I was right there in all those meetings. Now, I just wanted to ask one thing. We didn't see much African representation recently in Qatar, Doha. That is the COP, Convention of Parties 18, held last year around October to November. We didn't see much of the African or Kenyan representation. I don't know why, because our continent is wrought with environmental problems, and I thought that was a continuation of Durban COP 17. I wonder why.
You can go
Okay,
ahead.
so today I'm representing Middle East ambassador, so we might have gotten some of your secrets, as you thought it was only Africans here today. But thank you so much for that descriptive picture you've given us of how negotiations go, and we hopefully will be joining you soon. My question basically is on how are you dealing with the challenge that you mentioned, especially when it comes to lack of e-archives where you can access information at your fingertips so that we are able to be at par with the more developed countries.
Much for the presentation. I'm really impressed, especially by your ability to capture all that and to give that presentation without really seeming to refer a lot. I think it reflects a lot of, there was quite a lot of reflection after the entire experience to capture all those lessons. And one key issue that has kept coming from your presentation is the appreciation of a resource that we may not really have appreciated before as a country, which is the human resource, because you kept referring to the group of young Kenyans who did quite some exemplary work. And what I wanted to know is, what did it take to prepare these people prior to this effort so as to achieve that kind of coordination, that kind of passion, and that kind of commitment? Yeah, thank you.
In addition to everything else that you've said, is that when the Kenyan team went for negotiations, they would finish as late as 3 a.m. And I think I can declare openly today that we could actually end that late because we have a negotiation to do. Anyway, back to my question. It's more on the practical side. How do you balance between serving national interests and conceding or giving in to some of the things that you wouldn't ordinarily let go in order to achieve the ultimate goal? For instance, with UNEP, you obviously, I would like to assume, had to let go or give in to some of the things that you wouldn't ordinarily give away.
To cover them to the level of detail or revelation that you need, these two gentlemen, the lady there, I'm sure they can answer this question. In fact, her question was quite rhetorical. She has a very clear answer to this issue, but I appreciate the question. One, our participation in COP18 in Qatar, I don't have a clear answer for you. in terms of an answer that really explains exactly what happened, why we were not represented as substantively as we should have been. But it's to tell you that there's been, over time, a proliferation of negotiations, right? So at any given time, like right now, I could be somewhere at a table with a microphone, right? There's a picture I took once with my mobile phone of one of these mics in the UN table, and I titled it "Weapon in the Foreground, Enemy in the Background," because I could see a hazy other figure, and this was the way to fight them. Anyway, so this proliferation of negotiations means you either have to have a really, really large diplomatic corps, which we don't, or you have to really be exceptionally organized. The way multilateral negotiations are evolving in terms of the sheer volume of issues that need to be negotiated and debated means that the whole game plays into the hands of very well-resourced countries. And so countries such as Kenya are going to have to figure out a different way of structuring our diplomatic corps to allow us to have a better understanding of what are the negotiations that are completely critical to us and which ones are less so. I believe that the sort of reforms that are possible now under Ambassador Amina, the new cabinet secretary, and the real sense of the need for transformative agenda may turn out with new ideas about how to approach these issues. None of these ideas, I've heard ideas being bandied about, but none of them is at a solid enough stage to even talk about. But we're going to need somehow with scholars, people who have been studying diplomacy for a long time, to really craft new ways. We may need to use our diaspora in a different way. We may need to have temporary diplomats. Somebody who lives in Japan, who's an environmentalist, who goes to New York, takes their vacation and represents us for a month after. I don't know, but somehow we have to figure out a way of doing this. And it's going to be very exciting to look forward to that. The other reason sometimes the African representation is weak is that even though Africa is really African countries are very different. Kenya is very different from other African countries and vice versa. And there are many African countries that are still very much in thrall, who very much follow a certain line laid out by certain countries. So why turn up if you know your negotiating position is already decided? And that's not just African countries, South American countries, Asian countries, those little islands all over the place, their votes are just rung in. And actually something I was going to say where I knew that I would really enjoy being a Kenyan civil servant was that when ultimately at that negotiation, just remember, when ultimately it came down to, okay, we just need to get like 5 people in the room so that we decide this thing. For the whole world, Kenya was there. It was America, it was the EU, it was the Japanese, it was the Chinese, but they couldn't leave Kenya out because of the various ways in which our delegation had acted, the fact that we're the headquarters of UNEP. So these things matter. So our representation varies because of our resources, others because of lack of interest, and also because of how we have a hard time prioritizing. Something may seem less important today, but it's actually the key to a much more important issue. The prioritization issue, we need a lot of work on it. Our sister from the Middle East, what country in the Middle East? That's Africa. It's just this little strip of ocean here. It's only the British who called it Middle East. Do you know where it's Middle East from? You know why there's a Middle East, a Near East, and a Far East? It's calculated from Greenwich in London, right? So when us guys say Middle East, what do we mean? Is it the middle of what East? So how do we deal with challenges like e-archives? I know at the mission we're starting one on a software called Podio. And it's a sort of combination between a database and a social media. So it sort of combines Facebook and a database. So I can upload something and write some comments that don't come on the document. And then somebody in Geneva can just log in and see, oh, Martin Kimani said that this is where the negotiation ended. These are some of the things. Here are some of the countries that were with us on that. And then they can just continue where we left off in Nairobi. So we're going to be trying to pioneer this. We are calling it a proof of concept. So rather than trying to do a big plan for the ministry, we'll just do a small little plan for our mission. And if it works, maybe it'll be taken up by the entire ministry. The other question, and by the way, this issue of e-archives speaks to the need. There are phrases now that are coming up like e-diplomacy. You know, you find my fellow ambassadors, especially from the West, are on Twitter all the time. Me, I haven't dared go on Twitter because we don't have a clear understanding of how to use that tool and you know, effectively. So like now I should be tweeting with students at I don't know what, their hashtags and this kind of thing. So we don't have an understanding, but certainly there's something there about how we communicate to the public, because after all, our constitution does oblige us to be in communication with the Kenyan public. So how we're going to do that is really the question. And diplomacy has been very much a closed club. You know, you're guys, you've learned how to use all the forks. You know, you speak in a very particular way. You know, you have a lot of style, and you're cut off from everything, you know. A diplomat abroad sees the world from inside a car with tinted windows that drives you quietly from one place to the other. You know, and so this little closed club talks to itself. So even if I was to tell you what really, like if we're building a website, but we're asking what on that website could possibly be interesting. Because the really exciting things, I cannot put them there. I cannot put that I had a delegation tell someone, you better look for another job because your career is finished. Now that's exciting, but I can never put it there and say this representative of country X told a member of UNEP or Habitat XX in my hearing, because that's not right. So it'll be this boring. So we have to think of ways to communicate to the public. And so e-archives, using digital tools, it's all part of the same package. And indeed, if you do come into diplomacy with a better understanding of how to do these things, you'll find a lot of willing ears with time. What did it take to prepare those young diplomats I was talking about? The reason I appreciated them so much personally is because I've not always been a Kenyan government civil servant. I've spent most of my time outside of government, a substantial amount of it in the private sector. And so I had the stereotype of Kenyan government people that many Kenyans have. This bunch of, you know, corrupt, lazy people who just try and block everyone. Then to my incredible delight, I go in and I find extremely dedicated people who are busy trying to work in systems that have sometimes become bad because of the way the system is set up, but people who work exceptionally hard. And when people say Kenyans are cynical, I completely disagree, because you can complain as if you're cynical, but when you're put on the negotiating table and you're told you're now representing Kenya, and across the table is so and so, I tell you, all that, what you call cynicism, will just fly right out of you, because you will feel the pride and the understanding that what you're doing matters to people. Like if the UN can grow, I mean, if we can grow from 6,000 to 10,000 employees at the UN, there's no other single source of revenue as big that Governor Kidero will have in the next 5 years. None. Yeah. So it really does matter. And so in terms of the preparation, we had a series of meetings before to try and look at our negotiating position and try and fine-tune it within the context of the Africa group especially, and try and make sure that the Africa group arrives at that negotiating table in a united fashion as opposed to broken up in between ourselves because we don't agree with one another. And when you don't, you're picked off like a lion picking up off antelopes. You just cut one off and then you eat it. So we needed to be a herd that was bound by a common purpose. And the Kenyan purpose had to be explained and articulated in a way that made it a continental purpose. And that is not easy to do. And finally, of course, there were different diplomats with different roles in different rooms. And my job was to prowl around, getting advice from them on what to do next. And then finally, to talk to the technical experts at the Ministry of Environment on the particulars about issues around resolutions that had to do with technical detail. The final question was on how to balance between national interests and compromise during negotiations. I think this is an especially difficult thing. One is, you'll have heard this term, ambassador plenipotentiary. Have you heard that term? It's a fantastic term. When I saw it first on my documentation, I was like, wow, that sounds fantastic, but I didn't actually know exactly what it meant. And then I had to go and Google it. But what it is that I have the ability to make a deal at a conference that to a certain extent commits Kenya. Now that's a big responsibility. And this came from a time when ambassadors were representatives of kings, in a time when people used to ride carriages. It would take, how long to go from Brussels to Paris? 4 or 5 days? 3, 4 days, right? And so you didn't have time to call on your mobile and be like, okay, so this is their position now. What should I do, right? You had to be able to make a commitment at that particular time. And you can't always win all the battles. You have to compromise. So the ambassador sometimes is empowered to do that. Now, of course, there are limits. You can't say, oh, the ambassador plenipotentiary has declared war on the United States of America because he was sitting at a table somewhere and felt, no, there are limits, but there's something there about at the negotiating table, you're able to compromise and really stick by your word and know that it'll be supported, and that's very important. The other thing about this idea of compromise is the people who are sitting across from you, it's very important to know who they are. So for instance, at this last Habitat Governing Council, one of the delegations I was fighting as the hardest, and I use that word advisedly, fighting, but let's say debating us and negotiating with us, the hardest, was led by someone from their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, from their headquarters, from their capital city, who was senior in the ministry, but actually didn't have the ability to strike a deal. They had the ability, they had been told come for one particular thing, and that was the thing they were going to go. Either they have it or they don't have it. And you could feel the rigidity and the inability to compromise, which was couched in a lot of fancy moral language about, this, we are reformers and want reform. But ultimately it was that I'm here and I'm not able to negotiate myself out of this situation. I can't compromise. And that weakened their position quite a bit, I thought. So there's a constant issue of compromise. Now, because negotiation is never done, the negotiating and advancing your national interest never stops. There are times when you compromise on something, but then you can advance it later. There are other times where compromise is not possible. Let me give you a very solid example. At the UN Habitat Conference, His Excellency President Uhuru, in his opening speech, commended UNEP for having taken universal governance, said that Kenya believes in the universal governance option. It thinks that in this day and age, this is the best way for global organizations to be governed. And that was now his opening remark. Now that right there put me in a steel cage, right? Because if the head of state has said that, and of course he said it because the Kenyan state, in his briefings and in his speech, this had been the position that had been taken. But because it's him who now said it, at the opening session, it created an immediate barrier. We now knew that was our red line. We could compromise all other kinds of things. But that one, we were going to even now go till 6 a.m. and completely disagree. Because, of course, at that governing council, things can go to a vote, but diplomats don't like voting. Yeah, they prefer consensus. And when you're defeated, when clearly the consensus is not with you, sometimes you give in to fight another day. So that created for us a very hard line that we had to keep. And what that meant is that there are countries that had come here determined to change the governing structure, and we completely refused. We said, you're going to have to wait till 2015, 2016 to revisit this question again. We're not going to agree. And in that way, our national interest at that point was not necessarily so much a national interest in that grand way, but it was a national position vis-a-vis a new head of state who'd made his first speech to the UN, and whose diplomacy has a great deal of desire to assert Kenyan strength and Kenyan capability on the international stage. So that was going to be something we had to stick to, come what may. So sometimes you can't compromise, but other times you can, and other times you just play a delaying game. Diplomats are fantastic at kicking the problem down the road for someone else to deal with it.
Okay, thank you very much, Bwana Ambassador, for really, as I said earlier on, a wonderful lecture. I'm sure that this has been a very, very useful afternoon for these young diplomats. Every year we have this kind of exercise, simulation of bilateral and multilateral negotiations. And we are really very, very happy that you are able to come this afternoon. I think listening to you, it's very clear that diplomacy is not just wearing nice suits and going to those cars and what have you. The issue is, what are you bringing home for the country economically? When you go to negotiate, can you be able to count the benefits that you are actually bringing as an ambassador? What can you say was your contribution for the 3 years you were there in London, New York, in Giri here, wherever? And the UNEP is actually a very, very good example of the link between diplomacy and economics, which is one of the national key areas of national interest. I always tell my students here that today's diplomat spends possibly more than 70% of his or her time on economic issues. Possibly more than that, but minimum 70%. And you can see the implications that UNEP, both the upgrading and the earlier when the program came up, and George Moore tell me about the story of how the UNEP came up, the first program. It's really tells you a lot about personal commitment as an ambassador, with very clear focus on an issue where you have counted cost and benefits very well. I work with Michoke, who would always put his pen down and calculating how many jobs are we getting, what is this and this. This is the kind of mind you need in today's diplomat. It's not just enjoying yourself, going to the dinners and what have you. Well, those are necessary, I think, as he has said. But it is really, when you bring a program here that is the first major foreign exchange earner for the country, you have done something. You deserve to be given national knighthood and whatever, because you have done something major in whatever year. As he said, if you are to remove UNEP here, which was actually under major threat during the post-election violence, the implications would be unthinkable in the terms of economic impact on the Kenyan economy. So when we do our small CSRs here, politics and what have you, without implications, knowing the implications of what we are saying, even when we are disagreeing as country or whatever, really we have no idea of the key economic implications. So I'm very happy about the example here. It's a major issue, and it's an outcome of negotiations. So that you know negotiations is not like this simulation exercise where, okay, it is important that part of running, running the tools of being a diplomat, but it's not much at stake for you. When you are negotiating, is something much more serious for the country, for your career as such. And I think the story that he has given is very, very important. I hope that one day that the story will be possibly properly written for wider circulation. That the story of Kenya's diplomacy, we have a lot of critics here who say Kenya doesn't have any foreign policy. Kenya doesn't have this. I think we are very happy in criticizing ourselves, sometimes without asking what do we exactly mean. And I think what Dr. Kimani is saying is really a very articulated type of diplomatic engagement, very focused, very focused. And this is what we want you to be. As in diplomats for all the countries represented here, you have a very major role to play. And I'm happy that now in Kenya we are giving our diplomats a performance contract. So at the end of the year, what are those targets that you have been able to achieve? Something that you have signed, that these are my targets that I'm going to achieve. But you need to go beyond those. Sometimes some of us make very simple targets that you can easily achieve. But the issue is how the little issues that matter. Negotiating that upgrading of UNEP and many other things. Every day, in every zone, every sector, there are those major deals. And these are the ones that come out of the multilateral negotiations and the bilateral negotiations. So it's not just really an exercise of talking, but you can count either in the short term and the long term, the benefits that you derive from that. So I want to thank you very much for bringing home this and for your commitment. And that you are bringing up very good young diplomats. I want you to be very happy to really to see whether we can be able to have you more and more, possibly give a few more lectures to our students at various levels, just to give a practical side. We have a number of practical lecturers here. Maria Nsomo, who was not able to come, and she has given her apologies. He himself has been a diplomat in many countries. So I think, but we want to engage very much between government and government institutions that I think we are able to bring up the best diplomats that we can. So ours is to wish you all the best, wish you a wonderful career as a diplomat, and may the Lord continue blessing you that the sky is not the limit. Asante sana.
Good afternoon. To welcome our guest.
To have you here, and indeed we are very proud to welcome you to this discussion. Yeah, so feel welcome and share with us. Thank you.
But I think we need to make a distinction between the substantive excellencies and, you'll soon become one. If you just continue the way you are doing, you'll be soon called really Your Excellencies. As you know, today we are having this simulation. It's really, we are trying to, in a sense, prepare our students to learn how diplomacy really works in practice, and to learn how when they become eventually diplomats like yourself, and as you know, I was also myself a diplomat, I was an ambassador, so I know how it's like. It's not something you wake up one morning and just do. So they have to, we not only take them through the theory, which is they go through in class, but this is part of the practice. So that they learn the practical ways of not just doing the normal day-to-day work in their various embassies, but also how to negotiate, because this is what diplomats do on a daily basis. They don't spend their time in their offices. They go to negotiate for their national interest in various fora, depending on whether it's bilateral station you are in or a multilateral station. And I have had the privilege, Your Excellency, to work in both capacities, both as a bilateral ambassador as well as a multilateral ambassador. And so this is very opportune because this afternoon they're actually trying to see in a simulated way how Kenya and India can enhance our bilateral relations, which even in real life are very, very good relations. But before we get to that, some of you who may not know, the ambassador, you may want to know a little bit more about the ambassador, His Excellency Sibabrata Tripathi. He is, a scholar in his own right. He obtained a BA and an MA degree in history from Stephens College in University of Delhi. And after that, he of course entered the Indian Foreign Service in 1971. He also lectured in history at University of Delhi. So he's both a career diplomat as well as a former lecturer, and I think that's another thing we share, you and I. And he has worked in various diplomatic missions of India. He has worked in Cairo, in Abu Dhabi, in Seoul, in Helsinki, Panama, and Colombo, before he was then appointed as ambassador to the Republic of Madagascar and the Union of Comoros in 2002. He was then thereafter appointed High Commissioner to Uganda, and was also accredited as ambassador to Rwanda and Burundi. Before his appointment as the High Commissioner of India to the Republic of Kenya, the High Commissioner was Joint Secretary, West Asia and North Africa Division in the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi. So you can see he has a very, very rich history of diplomatic service. And for him, I think he'll be, maybe he'll be able to tell you, some things in his, presentation about, just some of the tips that you may need, even as you try to prepare yourself for that one day that you may actually be, a substantive ambassador representing Kenya in India. And you may need to know some of the things that you need to prepare yourself for. But I'll leave that to Ambassador I should be saying High Commissioner, really, because as you know, there is a distinction. High Commissioners are always representatives, ambassadors who are representatives of their countries to all the Commonwealth countries. And both India and Kenya are part of the Commonwealth. So I think, though they mean the same, but we make always that distinction. So again, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Institute of Diplomacy and International Studies. And really what we are simulating here is really very warm bilateral relations that have already been existing in reality between Kenya and India. And they date back very many centuries, even before both Kenya and India became independent states. And these cordial relations between us really have not just been empty cordial relations, but they have really been enhanced in both the matters of economic relations, bilateral trade between the two countries, which has increased over time. And as of 2011-2012, volume of trade had gone up to $2.4 billion US. And this was, on the average, a 44% annual increase in our trade statistics between the two countries. And in that regard, of course, now as we speak, as you know now, there is all this talk about the BRICS, and India is part of the BRICS. And it's a big phenomena. And as we talk about the BRICS, we always talk about Kenya's economic relations with India in that regard. And we are proud to say that, now India, has become, one of the top markets for Kenya's, both imports and exports. And we are now actually ranked the sixth largest trading partner for Kenya, which is very important. And we deal, of course, with all manner of things. You know them, Your Excellency. I'm not going to go through them. And so really in being here, you are not only witnessing a simulation of what our students have learned and they continue to learn, but also really is a reflection of the very warm, cordial bilateral relations between Kenya and India. And on that note, I really want to thank you again and welcome you to say whatever you want to our students. Anything you tell them, they will learn a lot from you, Your Excellency.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Zomo. In keeping with, I must begin by saying esteemed co-chairs and excellencies and members of both delegations. But in keeping with normal templates of bilateral negotiations, we do this sitting down, not standing up. So I shall claim that liberty for myself, and I shall speak to you with your permission, sitting down here. What I plan to do today is first to thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. Believe me, it's not only good for you to listen to me, but it's good and useful for me to be speaking to you, to be interacting with you, and to notice this undercurrent of interest in subjects such as bilateral relations, how to augment them, how to enhance them, how to negotiate your way through the sort of myriad channels of diplomacy. So what I shall do is give you a vignette, as it were, of the kind of relations that exist between Kenya and India. As Ambassador Zomo remarked, these relations are not new. They're very old. But I will not inflict a textbook on history on you. I shall be brief, and then I'll hopefully try to share with you how bilateral negotiations, usually what they aim towards and how they end in terms of documentation and things. I'm very happy to be with you, the IDIS students and faculty, as you work on a simulation exercise on bilateral talks, and particularly aimed at enhancing, and this is an important word, the content and nature of relations between India and Kenya. Kenya, to my mind, is indeed fortunate in that it is not only that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here has its own diplomatic academy, but that an institution as distinguished as the University of Nairobi has within it an institute such as the IDIS, dedicated to the study of international relations. Since you will discuss relations with India, please permit me, Ambassador Zomo and all of you, to recall one important piece of history that connects my country, India, to the University of Nairobi. After the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi in 1948, a year after India's independence, a group of Indians living in East Africa, in what was then Kenya colony, what was then Tanganyika, what was then Uganda, got together and decided, as a mark of memory to Gandhi, to collect funds, both in East Africa as well as in India, to collect funds to set up an institution of learning, which they planned to call the Gandhi Memorial Academy in Nairobi. They visualized an institution that would resemble what was then known as Makerere College in Kampala, which would teach just about every subject possible. Not yet a university, because remember, these were affiliated to the University of London for some reason those days, Makerere. I leave it to your spare time and to your internet research to find out how this idea evolved, with additional financial contributions from the Government of India, from various East African countries, and from others. This led to the founding of Royal Technical College and later University College, Nairobi, in 1961. In 1956, the eminent Indian philosopher, diplomat, and statesman, Dr. Radhakrishnan, visited Nairobi and unveiled the statue of Gandhi that you see in the Gandhi Memorial Library now. Since then, many Indians and many Kenyan graduates of Indian universities, including former Minister for Foreign Affairs. I mention Foreign Affairs because that is what you are going to be embroiled in very shortly, and the present Cabinet Secretary for Education have taught in your university. These were both graduates of Indian universities. I'll come back to the role of education in bilateral relations. There was life, as Ambassador Zoma mentioned, before the compulsions of colonialism brought us together. Indians were trading with towns along the East African coast since pre-Christian times. We have archaeological evidence in the ruins of many settlements. We also have linguistic evidence in the numerous Indian loanwords to be found in Kiswahili. We know how the cutting of the Suez Canal heightened colonial attention in our region, and how the decision to build the Uganda Railroad brought Indian laborers, carpenters, mechanics, etc. to Kenya, and through them added variety to your demographics. They are a part of your demographic mosaic. Indians contributed in many other ways to Kenya colony, to life in Kenya colony in those days, as teachers, doctors, lawyers, policemen, etc. With independence in 1947 for India, the floodgates of decolonization were opened all over Asia and Africa. New nations emerged independent from British, Dutch, Portuguese, and other assorted colonial rule. Anti-colonial movements emerged in East Africa too, of which Mau Mau was one expression. Indians such as Makhan Singh and Pio Pinto, remembered now as Kenyan heroes, made important contributions to the achievement of Kenyan independence. When Mzee Jomo Kenyatta and other leaders were tried by the colonial authorities for sedition, what became known as the trial of the Kapenguria Six, Prime Minister Nehru sent a member of parliament from India, Diwan Chamanlal, to join the defense team for the Kapenguria Six. At this time too, my first predecessor here, Appa Pant, appointed Commissioner of India to British East Africa in the first year of our independence, 1947, decided that besides supporting Kenyan leaders such as Kenyatta, India would also do what it could to help in capacity building through a scholarship program that enabled many Kenyans to study engineering, medicine, economics, or train in the trades. Others, such as Oginga Odinga, for example, went on long familiarization trips to India. He stayed in India for 2 months, wrote a book on it. Most of this early generation has passed on, but our scholarship program has grown stronger, even as the Kenyan university system has itself become self-sustaining. Another important facet of such solidarity between India and Kenya was Indian capacity building assistance in industrial technology, demonstrated through investment ventures such as the Raymond Woolen Mills in Eldoret, the Pan-African paper mills in Webuye, Berger Paints in Nairobi, or, for example, the supply of machinery to create an industrial estate in Nairobi. I have spent some time on education and technology for one reason. Although we commonly view the Kenya-India relationship through the prism of trade alone, and justifiably so, as last year, for example, as Ambassador Zoma mentioned, India was the largest exporter to Kenya. It is important to see the Indian contribution in its many other varied aspects that also include recent investments in chemicals, petroleum distribution and refining, mobile telephony, ICT, healthcare and pharmaceuticals, floriculture, dairying, food processing, etc. India is not a traditional donor to Kenya. And although it is so, many industrial ventures here have benefited from Indian soft credits. Under a line of credit of $61.6 million signed in 2010, several transmission lines are being built between points in Kenya as your country continues to invest in the energy sector. India and Kenya also enjoy good defense cooperation relations. I don't know how many of you know that. mainly through training for Kenyan officers and other ranks in Indian defense training establishments, exchange of visits, etc. On the softer side of things, you'll be happy to know that Indians are traveling to Kenya for tourism in ever-increasing numbers. Many of these aspects of our common relationship can provide examples for your discussions. A word now on how we work with the government of Kenya. We have always tailored our cooperation programs to Kenyan priorities. Now, this is an important point. When we deal with countries as equals. Therefore, we administer our scholarship program, for example, in close consultation with relevant ministries. We discuss trade and industry matters through the Ministerial Joint Trade Committee. Our foreign affairs and other ministers meet at bilateral as well as multilateral forums. For example, India and Kenya are founding members of the Indian Ocean Association for Regional Cooperation. Kenya has a High Commission in New Delhi, and I'm very happy to tell you that the next Kenyan High Commissioner to India, a lady of some distinction, leaves for her assignment tomorrow. Kenya also has an honorary consulate in Mumbai. We have a High Commission in Nairobi, and we have an Assistant High Commission in Mombasa. I hope I've given you an overview and some food for thought for your discussions. A word on process. As Ambassador Zoma would have told you or will tell you, most intergovernmental talks ultimately result in one or several forms of international instruments. These could take the form of treaties. Treaties comes from Latin and indirectly a French word that means to negotiate. It could take the form of a convention. It could take the form of agreements, protocols. I notice in your tentative agenda here that you will work towards a protocol. It can take the form of agreed minutes. It can take the form of a declaration, which could be in the form of a policy pronouncement, or it could be, it could resemble an agreement. Some governments prefer to conclude a memoranda of understanding, or MOUs as they're called. And very often we have an exchange of notes. These are all various forms of understanding of greater or less rigor, but nobody, believe me, goes back on understandings and agreements. I'll also give you a list of what exists, because you are going to discuss enhancing, obviously, enhancing what exists. I'll just give you a list of agreements that do exist. Trade agreement, 1981. Cultural agreement, 1981. Now remember, 1981 doesn't mean that they're outdated. It's just that once you sign an agreement, it's good till one party or the other revokes it, unless specifically there's a mention that this agreement is valid for 10 years or 20 years or whatever. But otherwise, they are open-ended. They're valid. Convention on the Avoidance of Double Taxation and Prevention of Fiscal Evasion with respect to taxes on income, 1985. Agreement on the establishment of an intergovernmental joint commission for political, economic, cultural, scientific, and technical cooperation. That was signed in 1999. An agreement for air services, 1996. A memorandum of understanding on bilateral air agreement between India and Kenya. Now, when you have an agreement and then a memorandum of understanding, obviously somebody is trying to amend a particular clause. Again, an air services agreement, a new one in 2009. A memorandum on technical cooperation in telecommunication, 2001. A memorandum for consultations between the ministries of External Affairs of India and Foreign Affairs of Kenya, signed in 2003. An agreement between the Export-Import Bank of India and the government of Kenya for a line of credit for $61.6 million to finance power transmission lines in 2010. An agreement on mutual cooperation between the National Small Industries Corporation of India and the Kenya Industrial Estates Limited, 2009. An agreement on Pan-African e-network between Telecommunication Consultants India Limited and the Kenya ICT Board in 2009. a memorandum of understanding between the India Trade Promotion Organization and the Export Promotion Council of Kenya in 2003, a memorandum of understanding between Kenya Electricity Transmission Co., KETRACO, and the Power Grid Corporation of India in 2011. I've given you a long list of agreements that already exist, and I leave it to you to negotiate your way forward and enhance this relationship, which, to my mind, is already a beautiful one, based on respect for each other, based on equality, and based on advancing the mutual interests of both countries in a way that's harmonious and, I think, a good example to everyone else around. We value our relationship with Kenya, and we're proud of what we've tried to do so far, and we have plans for the future that will enable us to work together with our Kenyan friends to take this relationship even further. Thank you, and if you have specific questions, I'll spend a couple of minutes with Ambassador Zomo's permission trying to answer them. Thank you.
Very much, Your Excellency. I only have one question as we deliberate this afternoon. From where you sit as the actual High Commissioner for India to Kenya, are there any, say, 5 priority areas that you'd like to see enhanced between the on trade relations between Kenya and India? Thank you. Today I'm representing India as the Minister of Commerce. Thank you.
Okay, for Foreign Affairs from Kenya. And my question to the High Commissioner of India to Kenya is simple. When you look at the balance of trade between Kenya and India, in a way it is purely imbalanced. What should Kenya do to improve, or what can we focus on as a nation so that we can improve the balance of payment?
Communication India, and I would like to inquire how India, or rather how can India assist Kenya to advance in medical technology, especially through cooperation with our local universities in view of advanced medical awareness in India. Thank you.
It's a mix. In India, we call our ministers honorable ministers, and there are 2 of you have outvoted the one Kenyan here, I notice. Now, 5 priority areas in which India can work with Kenya. One of the points that I tried making more than once was that India, with regard to any country, any friendly country, works to the priority of the country that it is dealing with. India does not work to its own priorities. And I mean this from the bottom of my heart. I have nothing to lose here. I'm with students. And even though a diplomat's basic core business is to be a liar, he does not lie to students. The lecturer in me takes over, and I stop lying when I see students, believe me. What are the 5, if there were 5, priority areas for Kenya? I think we are just 2 days away from the absolutely eloquent speech that His Excellency the President of Kenya gave just day before yesterday to the nation. And that speech, more than any other document that I'm aware of, sets out Kenya's priorities. Kenya's priorities are no different from, coincidentally, from that of India's. We are both, like it or not, we are both developing countries. India is not a rich country. It may have been fortunate in having industrialized. It certainly has one of the world's largest economies, but it hasn't forgotten the path it took itself as a developing country. We know where we came from. Having said that, the priorities clearly are infrastructure, The priorities clearly are energy, healthcare, employment. I mean, these are Kenya's priorities. These are India's priorities too. And if we are to help or assist or work together in partnership with Kenya, those are the priority areas that we will work with. Therefore, when you see a line of credit for $60 million for transmission lines, it's really to enhance Kenya's capacity in the energy sector. That power is not going to go to India at all. It's going to stay here or hopefully get exported around the region, as Kenya plans to do, through a grid. Right after this meeting, I'll be meeting with the chairman of one of our largest government water organizations. He's here because somebody's invited him to have a look at some irrigation-related issues in Western Kenya. These are the priorities. Really, whatever Kenya's priorities, food security is a priority. I don't know what all we can do in that area, but when I say irrigation, clearly it is with the intention to augment food security that we talk of irrigation. I now come to another area which I don't know whether I'm really equipped to answer. How can India assist Kenya in medical technology? Now, it speaks very poorly of the Indian minister to be asking his own High Commissioner how he can do that. But having said that, what does Kenya lack? Kenya, to my mind, in the medical sector, lacks only economy of scale. It doesn't lack good doctors. It doesn't lack scientific brains. It lacks economies of scale, therefore its costs are high in delivering healthcare. We have a larger population, so when we establish one institute, we can take care of many, many more millions of people in that, and costs get absorbed in that manner. In the early years, as I said, India helped with medical education. People like Sam Ongeri, who did their medical degrees in India, and there were others. Now, a lot of Kenyans go to India, but in the long term, I don't think that's the answer. What does it do? It adds, it augments Indian capacity. What does that achieve? It really achieves nothing. At least achieves very little for Kenya. So clearly the answer lies in augmenting capacity in Kenya, within Kenya. There have been one or two significant joint ventures. I won't name names, but there's a facility called Medanta, which opened last year, I think late last year. This would be one way of doing things. The other way of doing things would be internationally. Since you mentioned assisting Kenya in medical technology. I'll give you one example. Since we are in the domain of communications, there is something called the Pan-African E-Network. It was announced by a former president of India, Dr. Abdul Kalam, who's a scientist, way back in 2005. It's been implemented in Kenya. It gives connectivities. It gives connectivities between two national universities, between a university here and a university in India, between two super specialty medical institutions, one in Kenya, one in India, and it gives other connectivities. Now this is one area where through video conferencing, you can actually do your consultations without, the doctors can do the consultations without sending the patients up and down. I really don't know how else one can do things in this domain. Internationally, believe me, there is no shortage of interaction between Indian and Kenyan doctors. There's plenty of interaction in multilateral fora, in conferences and things like that. Balance of trade, it's terribly adverse in India's favor. It is. When Ambassador Zoma mentioned $2.4 billion in 2011-12, out of that, about 2.1 is Indian exports to Kenya. Somewhere around $300 million is Kenyan exports to India. And even those $300 million, I have no problems telling you, is the exports mainly of Magadi Soda Limited. Magadi Soda now It was a British company, but since then it has been bought over by Tata Chemicals, India. Would India like to buy more? Of course it would. Does India have a problem with running deficits with other countries? No. I'm going to give you an example. India's trade deficits now, globally, are way over $100 billion. We actually buy much more than we sell. It has gone to alarming proportions. We have huge deficits with some of our trading partners. But this is a fact of life. You can't just open and close taps. You produce more, you produce things cheaper, you will stand on your own feet or you get washed away. I can see plenty of scope how Kenya will one day, where my kids, when they come for simulation exercises, will be complaining in New Delhi to the Kenyan High Commissioner that he's running surpluses with me. It will happen one day. Trade is an odd sort of a thing. It flows with the tide. But today's reality, yes, there's an adverse balance of payments, and we don't like it either. We would like to buy more from Kenya. Thank you. If you'd permit me, I'll run along unless I take one last question. Thank you.
In giving lectures, my name is Ngereshoni Kiara, the Associate Director at the Institute. Dearly, let me thank you very much for being able to spare your time to come as a guest of honor to this exercise of Kenya-India simulation exercise on bilateral relations. When I came here, I found a very heated debates between the Kenyan side and the Indian side. And I was very, very happy because, you know, sometimes when we teach them, we are not sure how much they are absorbing, how much... But I was quite impressed with what they were showing, the understanding of very, very important issues. And thank you for really a very refreshing review of Kenya-India relations, dating many, many years. And I really find that you have taken time to know that history very, very well. That's one of the roles of the ambassadors, really, to be able to understand the country properly, to be able to represent your country's interests properly. And the way you have talked about the Kenyan-India relations is very, very refreshing. I have done a bit of work, a bit here on India and the Kenya relations, especially in the economic area. And this is very good. This University of Nairobi, we are very proud of the Ngadi Memorial Library. It is actually the symbol of the University of Nairobi. I remember I was involved in some demonstration when I was a younger lecturer, because when they were trying to change it from the library into a bookshop, we fought very hard because we were saying this is the symbol of the library, and we treasure that very much. It has played a major part in producing very, very many Kenyan technical people who have led the country in many, many areas. So India has played a very major role, and we want to really appreciate that. But we feel still, I think this university can do much more with more relations with maybe some links with some of your universities. Already one of our the current external examiner is from India. She is from Assista Institute of Teaching International Relations. She has been doing a very good job and giving us very good comments on the quality and the standards of our examinations and the teaching programs. So I think we are now searching for more links, more relationships between Kenya and India in many, many ways. And in the area of medicine, one of the areas that Kenyans have been very impressed with has been cancer treatment. And personally, I feel that if we were to get a way of starting that kind of establishment of the kind of facilities you find in India, which are made access to cancer treatment, very good treatment. And today, possibly many Kenyans visit India on treatment, especially on cancer, which I think India now seems to be the leading country, even overtaking US in many ways. So we are very happy with well, we have treatment, treatment, because you are the area of treatment has been very good, and we would like to borrow a leaf as a country, maybe from India. I'm hoping that our Minister for Health should be pursuing those issues much more vigorously, so that we have something fairly concrete. So anyway, we don't have a lot of time to, because you have another function. I'm hoping that you will actually be able to come again and speak to many of our students. We have a fairly, one of the biggest postgraduate programs here. We would like you to come again and talk again medially to most of the students, because this is just one group, so that they can learn more about India. So with those few remarks, may we wish you all the best, and may you enjoy your stay in Kenya and at the University of Nairobi, and come again. Thank you very much.